This morning, as a church, we gathered to celebrate a great feast in the life of our church, the feast of the Exaltation of the Cross. Every year on September 14th, the church gathers together for this feast day. And the thing is, when it falls on a Sunday, as it does today, this feast sort of supersedes the ordinary celebration for the Sunday in ordinary time. And I don't share all of that just so you have some what you might think is useless liturgical trivia, but it's meant to sort of demonstrate how important this feast is in the life of the church, how important the cross is for our lives as followers of Jesus. That the church, in her wisdom, has this feast as an important day in the life of the church. That the exaltation of the cross reminds us of this great gift of God's love, as we hear it proclaimed from the evangelist John today. But I think to really understand the exaltation of the cross, what it means for us to be a people who lift high the cross of Jesus, it requires us to really think about what the cross meant at the time of Jesus and what the experience of the cross was for Jesus. See, for us, we gather in a sanctuary like this, and we have this beautiful gold cross, this crucifix that is put right before us. Or maybe you can think about your sort of favorite image of the crucifixion or a cross from some famous or maybe not so famous artist in our history. Or maybe you can think about the cross that is around your neck, or for some of us, what's tattooed on us, as this sort of permanent reminder of how important the cross is in our lives. And the thing is, all of that is important, obviously, for our spiritual lives. All of that is a testament to the fact that we want to be a people who put the cross at the very center of our lives. That's why when you sit here in the sanctuary, the image that you see right above the tabernacle is the cross. That in every sanctuary, in every church around the world, in every Catholic church around the world, there is the image of the cross that is at the very center of our worship. But the thing is, the cross that's around your neck, or the one that's tattooed on you, or the image that's here in front of us near the altar, all of that doesn't necessarily convey to us the brutality of the cross and sort of the horror and the violence that Jesus would have experienced on the cross. That before we can celebrate the exaltation of the cross, I think we as disciples of Jesus have to be reminded of the humiliation of the cross, the sort of public shaming that the cross was used for in the life of the community, especially by the Roman Empire and especially at the time of Jesus. You see, those who were nailed to the cross, those who were crucified, were labeled as people who were insurrectionists or criminals. It was a form of capital punishment that was oftentimes reserved to slaves and criminals and those who were insurrectionists, those who were in opposition to the powers of the world at the time. And the thing is, if you think about Jesus' own life and his own story, then we know in his experience what the cross was. I mean, it challenges us to recall what it is that we celebrate during Holy Week every year. The sort of beginning of our celebration on Palm Sunday, as we hear for the first time the Passion narrative that's read in the celebration of Mass. And then again, when we gather together on Good Friday, we hear another version of the Passion narrative, and we hear this story of Jesus embracing the cross. You know, in our life of discipleship, we often hear how we have to be followers of Jesus who are willing to take up our cross and come after Jesus. That in a real way, the cross at the time of Jesus was an instrument and a symbol of torture and death. That's what it was. And that's what it was used for so many centuries in the life of the early Christian community. The cross was this instrument of torture and death. And if you recall sort of Jesus' own experience, as he enters into the city of Jerusalem, you recall that the shouts of Hosanna and the celebration that was taking place was quickly transformed just in a matter of days into the cries to crucify Jesus. And the humiliation that Jesus would have undoubtedly experienced as he was there in Jerusalem. The fact that he was put through this sham of a trial and sentenced unjustly, condemned to death. And as much as Jesus preached and taught about the fact that the Son of Man would suffer unjustly and be put to death, it was something totally different for Jesus and those followers to experience what he was experienced during that first Holy Week. The fact that Jesus was stripped of his garments, and Jesus had a crown of thorns placed on his head. That Jesus had to pick up his own instrument of death and torture and walk with it through the streets of Jerusalem. And then when he got to the hill of Calvary, the fact that Roman soldiers would have used nails to crucify him and nailed them through his hands and his feet. And then Jesus, that body that was lifted high on that cross, that looked out at a crowd of people that were beneath him. This mob of people who were rooting for the fact that he would soon be put to death. And even in the midst of that crowd, the faces, the familiar faces of family members and friends who were overwhelmed with this grief and this anger and this sadness for what they were witnessing before their very eyes. And then the fact that Jesus would have hung there on the cross, publicly humiliated in front of a group and a crowd of people who once were cheering for him and once saw him as the great hope for the world. And then as Jesus breathed his last and gave up his spirit, the cross, at least as the Roman officials intended it to do, fulfilled its purpose. It fulfilled its purpose as an instrument of death. And not just for Jesus and not just for those other two that were crucified with him on that day, but for countless others who were put to death by this barbaric practice of crucifixion. And the thing is, we come today to celebrate the exaltation of the cross. Because the thing that we've come to know in our life of faith is that moment of Good Friday is not the end of the story. And it's in no ways the totality of Jesus' story and Jesus' own experience. That because of what happens on Easter Sunday, sort of the tyranny that was there on the cross and the violence and the brutality and the horror of that experience of Good Friday is transformed into something new. That when Jesus is risen on the third day, as Jesus bears the wounds of his crucifixion, but stands alive in front of his very disciples, the cross takes on a whole new meaning for us as followers of Jesus 2,000 years later. And every year that we celebrate this feast of the Exaltation, I'm always reminded of this great text that was written by Dr. James Cone. Dr. James Cone was an American theologian and contributed greatly to Black liberation theology here in our country, and he passed away in 2018. But nearly 25 years ago, he wrote this provocative and prophetic book that's entitled The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And what Dr. Cone does inside of this book is he offers a reflection that the experience of Jesus on the cross of Calvary is almost an anticipation of the experience that so many suffered unjustly here in our country during the period of racial terror in the late 18th and early and mid-19th centuries. That here in our country, more than 6,500 documented cases of people being lynched in our country have been recorded. And the vast majority of those who lost their lives during that time of racial terror were African Americans. And it wasn't just an experience that took place in the South. It was an experience that was found in many states across the United States. And the last or most recent documented case of somebody being lynched because of this racial terror took place in 1981. A 19-year-old man named Michael, who was lynched in Mobile, Alabama, at the hands of members of the Ku Klux Klan. So this experience of lynching in the United States is not something that happened hundreds of years ago. It's something that has happened in the lifetime of most of us who are gathered here in this church. But what Dr. Cone says in his book is that the experience of the cross and the experience of the lynching tree have all sorts of similarities. That just as the cross was this instrument of torture and this instrument that was meant to humiliate, so too was the lynching tree. And those who were put to death on the tree all across our country were individuals who were labeled as criminals and insurrectionists, people who had shams of trials and were sentenced unfairly and unjustly to death. And what would happen is mobs of white people would show up to stand around the lynching tree and celebrate the fact that this black person was about to be put to death. And then that person's body would be lifted high on that lynching tree. And a crowd of people would celebrate the fact that that tree had fulfilled its purpose in that moment, which was to bring about death and terror in the life of the community. And even for those individuals who experienced such a painful and barbaric and horrific death as that, they, like Jesus, would have looked out at a crowd of people who were cheering and excited for the death that was about to come. And then in the shadows, probably in the peripheries, all those familiar faces of family members and friends and people who were sympathizing with that person, who were there in that midst, trying to make sense of it all. That what James Cone says is that experience of the lynching tree can only find hope because of the cross. See, that's the point of us gathered today to celebrate the exaltation of the cross. We come not to celebrate an instrument of torture and death that was used historically. No, we come today to celebrate this symbol of God's love for the world. This symbol that is transformed from an instrument of death into a sign of life for the world. The whole thing is that Jesus was willing to experience the humiliation of the cross so that we might experience the exaltation of eternal life. To be reminded that as Jesus was lifted high on Calvary, God had a greater plan. That there was victory that would come for Jesus, and victory that would be won for us because of the cross. The Dr. Cone, in his reflection, in his writing in that book, is trying to make the point that the only way that the community was able to survive that experience of racial terror that existed in our country was because of the cross, because of the hope that was found in Jesus. And the claim that he makes so profoundly, and others have made throughout the centuries, is that God comes to know the experience of violence that is all too real in the world around us. And that's the point of us lifting high the cross. That the God we come to worship today is the God of the crucified and the God of the oppressed. The God who knows what it is to lose their son at the hands of violence in this world. And with all that is going on in our world and all that we have been witnessing over these last weeks, I think a lot of us are trying to make sense of what's happening in the world around us. And to put it plainly and simply, we will never make sense of the violence in the world around us. But as people of faith, we have something greater to point people towards. That when we put the cross, when we lift high the cross before the world that we find ourselves in, then we can be filled with this gift of faith and this gift of hope that God is able to transform something evil that's happening in the world around us. I mean, just think about the fact that here in our own city this past Monday, a 31-year-old black woman in Chicago on the south side was shot in the face. And the thing was, as horrific as that was, her family had to plead on social media for people to stop sharing the video of her lifeless body in the street. Or think about the Ukrainian woman who was on the subway in New York. This video that has been played on repeat over and over and over again that witnesses her stabbing and her ultimate death. Or the fact that we watch wars play out day after day on the news, watching places like Gaza be bombed over and over again, and we feel so far removed from the genocide that's taking place there in that city. The violence that we hear and live through too often in the city of Chicago and too often here in the United States. The fact that school children just a few weeks ago, as they were beginning a new year at Annunciation Parish in Minneapolis, would have had the sounds of their celebration at school mass shattered by the bullets that were coming through stained glass windows. the cries and the screams that would have been real in that church as these young people and the teachers and the staff were trying to make sense of what was happening in that moment. Or even the fact that somebody could be assassinated on a college campus, even if we don't agree with any of the views that that individual might have held. My point is that in our nation, since the very beginning, we have had this desire to sensationalize the violence that is taking place around us. And because of that, there is a trauma that exists in our country that every single one of us are living with. If you have fear because of what happens in your neighborhood or block, if you have uncertainty and anger about what's happening in the world around you, then you are living with the trauma of the violence that is so freely shared in our world. And the question for us, as we gather for our worship today, as we come to celebrate the exaltation of the cross, is what are we supposed to do in the midst of all of this? See, on the news, there's all this rhetoric and conversation about placing blame, either on the far left or the far right. And there are people to blame for the violence that's taking place. The perpetrators of the violence are to be blamed. Legislators who are afraid to tackle gun control in our country are to blame. The NRA in our country is to blame for the violence that is unfolding in the world around us. But our mission as church is to not get caught up in the blame game that is taking place among our politicians. No, our role as church is to be prophetic in this moment and to speak a word of hope in our world. That the cross that was lifted high on the hill of Calvary became a symbol that God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son so that everyone who believes in him might not perish but have eternal life. That's what the cross becomes for us who are followers of Jesus. The very sign and symbol of the love that God has for the world. God knows what it is to lose a son at the hands of violence. God knows the cries that have been rendered for generations in our nation because of all of the violence that is taking place. And what Dr. Cone makes clear in that book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, is that in every place of violence, in every place of torture, in every place of brutality, with every lynching, and we could add with every moment of gun violence in our country, God is there in the midst of it all. And God is present to bring a gift of hope to all those who are suffering through it. And I think for us, as people who come every single week to lift high the cross, to put the cross right at the center of our lives, to bow down in worship before the cross, then we can't be a people who remain silent with what's happening around us. And we can't be a people who get caught up in all of the political fighting that's happening around us. No, I think what we're called to as followers of Jesus, as the ones that God invites to take up our own cross and follow after him, is to speak honestly about the humiliation that comes at the hands of violence. Too many bodies that have been on street corners and blocks in our city. Too many names for us to even be able to remember as we gather here in the church. Too many generations of families that have experienced the terror of violence in our country. Something has to change. And church, I think that God is calling us to be that change, to be the ones who are filled with a hope that is absolutely unshakable. Not because of what happened on Good Friday for Jesus, but because of what happened on Easter Sunday. Because of that powerful reminder that joy always comes in the morning. Because of the fact that the crucified Jesus became the risen one who showed his wounds but stood fully alive in the midst of his disciples. Because that risen one is the one who has shared with us the gift of his very Spirit and the promise that the Son of God would be with us until the very end of the ages. That's how we can be filled with hope, that God is with us through all of the suffering that is real in our lives. So, church, we shouldn't be a people who just come to lift high the cross and pretend that there is not a lot of horror behind it, a lot of suffering, a lot of brutality, a lot of violence that is behind it. But the good news is, we don't have to stay there. We don't have to stay there because Jesus' sacrifice changes everything. So what the evangelist John says today, that God so loved the world, is what each of us are called to do. You've heard me say we shouldn't settle for the way things are in the world around us. We should be prophetic and radical in our fight in this moment to change things. And I think the only way that we'll be able to change this world is through the witness of our lives. That when we talk honestly about the sufferings that have been real for ourselves and the fact that we are still here is a powerful testimony to what it is that God is able to do. When you look back on your life and you think about all of those moments of trauma that you've experienced, all of those times of trauma that you might still be carrying with you as you gather here in this space, but to know that you are still standing, that is a powerful witness that can bring hope to the world. We might not ever be able to make sense of all of the suffering and all of the violence in the world around us. But what we can do is speak a word of hope and point people to the Easter Sunday that will follow their Good Friday, to let them know that God can transform their suffering into the promise of new life, and that all of those moments that we have experienced the humiliation of suffering in this world will bring us to the exaltation that is promised for us in the kingdom of heaven. So when we lift high the cross, we lift high all of that human experience that was real for Jesus. All of the pain and all of the violence and all of the brutality, but also all of the hope and all of the joy and all of the life and all of the love. That's our mission. That's what we are called to do in this moment that makes no sense in our country. To speak a word of hope and to remind people that for God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son.